Freedom is a pure idea. It occurs spontaneously and without instruction.
See what the Empire has done to your lives? Your families and your freedom?
Good people will fight if we lead them.
The rebellion is spreading.
Now we take the war to them.
The Republic will be reorganized
Systems either change or die.
into the first.
You give way to an enemy this evil with this much power, and you condemn the galaxy to an eternity of submission.
And wake up. There is one way. They're fighting from the start.
Long live the Empire!
Fight the Empire!
Let's call it war.
Remember this. Try.
Hey, Sophie.
Hey, Eleanor.
What do you call it when FN2187 is eating a popsicle on Jakku?
Star Destroyer shaped popsicle. I don't know.
A deserter having dessert in the desert.
Very good. Welcome to the Daughters of Ferrix podcast.
Wait. That's my line. Hello and welcome to Daughters of Ferrix, a podcast about Star Wars, politics, Star Wars politics, and the politics of Star Wars. I'm your host, Eleanor Mueller, and with me is my co-host. Who is that? It's Sophia Dunstan.
Shocking.
Sophie, if you could live on any Star Wars planet, what would it be?
They're also terrible, though.
They are really...
There's like no good...
I could count on one hand the number of really good...
like Alderaan, maybe. Alderaa's supposedly nice, or Naboo, but like everywhere else in Star Wars Galaxy is kind of a dump, so...
People always say Naboo when you ask people this question, because it's like the only place that's actually pretty and lasts.
It doesn't get like orbitally bombarded in Operation Cinder, I assume.
I mean, kind of.
Oh, great.
But it's not good, but Theed isn't destroyed. My go-to answers are always like Takodana from The Force Awakens, because it's green and pretty and has good vibes.
Takodana, do they have like tacos there?
I feel like Maz Kanata can make a pretty good like salsa verde, and yeah, they know how to do it over there.
The real question is, does she make like actual tacos or white people tacos?
Well, I want to say that she probably makes actual tacos, but it depends. She wouldn't be the one making the food. There's actually a chef character from Maz Kanata. This is so not worth talking about. A brief aside before we get started. I would like to thank Xylian's Network, Pokewan, Joel Davis, Ed, The Mediocre Master, Clary Moglody, SW Maniac 18, and Guillaume Decoteau for supporting us over on Patreon. And an extra thanks to Christian H for raising his pledge. You all are the station roof vent that keeps this show from experiencing an accidental liquid metal fuel spill. That's a niche one.
Where is that from?
That is from the Tashi Station page of the reference book Complete Locations.
Oh, okay. Actually, now that you mention it.
Yeah. Most of those jokes that I make are taken directly from visual dictionaries or cross sections. So.
Oh, yeah, there it is.
Did you go find it?
I did.
Yeah, it's right there. If you're interested in early access to the show, episode outtakes, the Daughters of Ferrix Discord server, and monthly bonus episodes, we're almost caught up, check us out at patreon.com/Daughters of Ferrix.
At its core, Star Wars is a fundamentally rural franchise. And that is a hard word to say. So you all should be grateful that I'm going to say it like 400 times today.
It's really not rural. Rural.
Rural.
You just say it.
Okay, well.
Rural. Just say it.
Rural. It's hard. Anyway, sure, there are bustling ecumenopoli like Coruscant or Hosnian Prime, and even mostly agrarian planets with large cities like Lothal, but the galaxy presented to us in Star Wars is overwhelmingly rural. The galaxy we see, despite its reputedly vast and cosmopolitan nature, consists mostly of a series of thinly inhabited or uninhabited worlds. Villages are more common than cities, speeders flying through empty land abound in place of crowded expressways and busy thoroughfares. Virtuous farmers living simple lives in the countryside are attacked by corrupt symbols of cosmopolitan urbanity and industrialization on an alarmingly frequent basis. For examples, see The Mandalorian and a bedazzling array of Clone Wars episodes.
Notably, in Star Wars, there's fucking nothing. There is wilderness for miles to see, or I guess there's wilderness all around. And that's because that element of Star Wars, the frontier element, is like deeply Western, right? This is Wild West. This is unsettled territory. And listen, the idea of the Old West being unsettled is a fundamentally questionable idea.
Flawed.
But Star Wars, generally speaking, lacks that type of colonialism in the like contemporary times that we see. It does appear, it especially is a factor in Legends, but that's not really important. But yeah, in Star Wars, everything is wilderness because Star Wars has to have that sort of quasi-lawless setting to play in.
Plus, like, you know, in terms of having a visual lexicon, everyone loves sort of a dramatic landscape shot. That's why there's like 2 billion like walking shots in Lord of the Rings where they can just show off the mountains of New Zealand or whatever. Like, everyone likes that.
It's the best part of the films. It is the best part of the films. The only Lord of the Rings game, which to date gives you the proper Lord of the Rings experience, is the Lord of the Rings Online, and it's because you spend most of your time in that game walking. I am not joking. I'm 100% serious about that. We've talked about it before, but in Star Wars, what planets are is like kind of metaphorical. Some planets are villages, some planets are cities, some planets are like metropolises.
I believe we call this trope the Planet of Hats.
It's kind of not even that it's the Planet of Hats, right? Planet of Hats is this planet is all this one thing. It's more like Star Wars does not actually believe that its planets are planets. It believes that its planets are backdrops for story to happen. And that is true in the way that Star Wars tells stories, but it means things that we often talk about as if they are literal worlds are just location. And as a result of that, any kind of frontier location becomes this like fundamentally rural place.
One might even go so far as to say that Star Wars is anti-urban. And I should be clear that I don't mean that in a bad way, right? Like, it's just not, it's sort of more interested in the frontier than the city. The differences between portrayals of urban and rural life in the series are stark. Corellia is largely a playground for organized crime and corporate nonsense, and there's no more wretched hive of scum and villainy than the mid-sized city of Mos Eisley. Twin Falls.
It's fucking everywhere. Nar Shaddaa is nicknamed the Smuggler's Moon because it is another city world that is so closely tied into the Hutt Syndicate that that's just what it is now. All of the like street level city environments we see are grungy,
terrible,
bad vibes.
Right, like Jeddah is like, what if Jerusalem was worse? Jeddah City, that is.
You know, and Jeddah City isn't exactly a metropolis, but just kind of generally, Dayu and Obi-Wan Kenobi is like sheer cyberpunk vibes.
I mean, it's cool.
Oh, it's super cool. I love these environments in Star Wars, but what successful cities are there?
Theed?
Well, I mean, yeah, there's Theed, but Theed isn't...
In the lexicon of Star Wars, Theed is not a city.
No, Theed is not like a modern urban location, right?
It's like Rome.
And I'm mostly thinking about on-screen stuff right now because that's basically what this episode treats with, right?
I mean, the city in like on Alderaan where Princess Leia grows up is also nice, but again, like in the lexicon of Star Wars, not really a city.
Like it is a city, but it isn't treated as a city. We only see it kind of from the top down. We don't see it street level. Sundari, which is the capital of Mandalore, is actually a city, is kind of treated like a city, but only kind of. We mostly just see its ruling monarchs and the stuff they do. There's that one fucking city in The Mandalorian, Guns for Hire, which is...
Oh, is that the one where they fight on the gantry?
Wait. Which one are you thinking of?
Because they're on like that ring world, aren't they? And they fight on the gantry below it in one of the Mandalorian episodes, or maybe...
Oh, you're thinking of episode 5 of the Book of Boba Fett.
Oh, that is... Yeah.
Yeah, there is Glavis Ringworld, you know, which is a metropolis, but also is a metropolis where most of what we see is basically like underhanded crime shit. No, I'm thinking of the one with Jack Black.
Oh.
The fake utopia with the extreme droid segregation and all of that shit.
Yeah.
Point is, cities are kind of ass in Star Wars.
When contrasted with the largely idyllic rural scenes of most of the franchise, cities look like a hellhole.
Just think about Coruscant.
Oh, yeah.
We never see actual life on Coruscant. And when we do, Doesn't seem really worth doing to me.
It's like either like super rich people stuff or crime.
Yeah, do the Jedi really live on Coruscant? Do the senators really live on Coruscant? Like, that's not urban living, is it? And besides, like, the senators are corrupt. Like, I don't know, it's always bad.
So it's all crime all the way down. The whole planet is crime. So like it's level like what is it? 1 to 56 something or another?
Except for level 5127. Is that what it is?
I think so.
Yeah! I did it right off the top of my head. I just fact checked it. Let's go.
I'm sort of impressed that you remembered that off the top of your head.
Sorry. I wasn't expecting to get it right.
Why is Star Wars so enamored with rural living? Does it actually know anything about rural life? And what does this tell us about the character of the American people? As it turns out, a whole lot.
I think the American people should be studied in a lab. What the hell is wrong with us?
Actually, they are studied in a lab. I study them in a lab. That's what political scientists do. So,
goddamn.
Here are my findings. The very first Star Wars begins, predictably, on a, quote, backwater planet. Well, not actually on the planet. There's a lovely little prelude with a Star Destroyer taking on the Tantive V4 before we ever get down to the surface. But when we do, well, that's where the real fun begins. We meet Luke, Owen, and Beru, a fairly prosperous family of moisture farmers who are buying a new set of droids. Why do I say that they're prosperous? Well, the aforementioned droid purchase is a good start. It's hard to purchase sophisticated farm equipment when you're in rough financial waters. Also telling is the implication that they already employ a number of hired hands, who are never seen on screen. Basically, they're doing all right. Moisture farming probably isn't the easiest profession in the world, even in the best of times, but the family's making it work.
Right, I mean, buying 3PO and R2 is expanding their operation, even in a little way. It doesn't seem like they're replacing droids that they just lost or something. You don't get 2 droids to replace... Like, yeah, this is an expansion of operations.
And that whole conversation where Uncle Owen's like,
this year we'll make enough on the harvest that I'll be able to hire some more hands, and then you can go to the academy next year.
oh, you already have some farm hands that you've hired. You didn't say, like, hire some farm hands. He says hire more farm hands. That's a lot of semantics doing the work for my argument here, but I feel like it holds up.
I mean, you know, maybe he means more hands than just his and Luke's, but I think it's a reasonable reading.
They have, like, a big-ass, like, Tatooine-style farmhouse. Are Chip and Joanna going to start renovating houses into this soon? Maybe. I don't know.
I definitely don't think they are rich by any means, but they are not poor. They're Tatooine middle class, which probably still sucks ass, but like...
Well, that's because Tatooine ages you really fast.
Sure does. That's what Tatooine is. Tatooine isn't sand planet. Tatooine is beach that makes you old planet.
There is, however, a tension at the heart of their entire family dynamic. One that Ellie's lovely girlfriend identified almost immediately when we were talking about rural life and Star Wars on a road trip.
Don't call my girlfriend lovely. Get your own.
It's a sort of conflict between those who leave and those who stay. Luke wants to get the hell out of Dodge. We see it clearly in a conversation between Luke and C-3PO.
It just isn't fair. Oh, Biggs is right. I'm never gonna get out of here.
Is there anything I might do to help?
Not unless you can alter time, speed up the harvest, or teleport me off this rock.
I don't think so, sir. I'm only a droid and not very knowledgeable about such things. Not on this planet, anyway. As a matter of fact, I'm not even sure which planet I'm on.
Well, if there's a bright center to the universe, you're on the planet that it's farthest from.
I see, sir.
Luke feels as though he is being left behind. His friends are leaving for what he perceives to be bigger and better things, which is a common sentiment among many, although by no means all, young people who grow up in a rural setting. It's a sentiment that George Lucas probably deeply identified with. Listeners may not know this, but our boy George was raised on a walnut farm in rural California. Instead of spaceships, he dreamed of fast cars and pretty girls, but it all sort of amounts to the same thing. Luke and George want nothing more than to leave the safety of the rural bubble to seek a better life in the milieu.
Word.
Cammy and Fixer stay on Tatooine, and we see them running the same shop in the Book of Boba Fett that they were presumably running in early drafts of A New Hope. Owen and Beru have even less desire to leave. They've been working on the same moisture farm for decades by the time their home is destroyed in A New Hope. The, I think, non-canonical, and Ellie will confirm this for me, Phineas and Ferb Star Wars special echoes this sentiment perfectly in its saccharine opening musical number. You can look, but you're never gonna find a better place to be than this little slice of heaven tucked between the Jundland Wastes and the Big Dune Sea. And so on. There's also a rap number and a scene implying that Phineas and Ferb are involved with the Hutts, but I digress.
Notably, this is not canon. I need you to know, Sophie, that is not canon. Phineas and Ferb were not aboard the Death Star concurrently with Han and Luke. I think that's how that goes.
Respectfully.
I don't know. I only saw that episode once.
Respectfully, I disagree. I reject your reality and replace it with my own.
I can't believe I'm going to have to cite Phineas and Ferb in the sources.
So, people with these inclinations exist in real life, too. I have friends from back home, which is like a very... I just realized I said back home like it's a normal thing people say.
Yeah. Where are you from, Sophie?
I'm from Nampa, Idaho, which is, to be clear, a suburb, but I know a lot of people who are not, if that makes sense. Because I went to this kind of like crazy private school for religious people and all the like kind of rich farmers would send their kids there. So I have friends from back home who chose to stay behind and keep running the farm, as well as folks who went away to educate themselves in order to become better agriculturists. What's key, though, is that there are significant differences in both experience and outcome between these two groups. Those who stay or return are statistically more likely to be in poverty, less likely to have attained higher education, and are literally less hopeful about the future. Rural life can be tough, but the disparity isn't just some inevitable outcome of living in a place that's not a city.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think there's this idea about rural living that people from urban backgrounds have, and it is that rural people are... it's like...
Poor, bored, and racist.
Or bored and racist. And listen, they are often bored and racist.
I mean, they are often all three, but they are not always all three.
I hesitate to make it sound like there aren't people who genuinely choose rural living, because there are many. But people often stay where they're from. It's hard to put down roots elsewhere. And yeah, if you're not in an adequate financial situation, even if you don't want to be living in the country, you're still going to be there. Funnily enough, people from rural backgrounds, not a monolith.
Shocking. So John Cromartie and some other guys from the USDA divide youth from rural areas into 4 groups. There's number 1, the stayer. They don't leave their hometown. They just take over the farm or whatever. Kind of stereotypical. The returner, who leaves home, presumably to get a degree in farm or whatever, and then comes back. A seeker who wants to leave but lacks money or is not a good student, so can't get a scholarship to a college or whatever. These people typically kind of join the military.
Oh boy.
Which is a really good way to get out of rural living.
Interesting. Big Starklighter? Luke Skywalker?
We'll get to that. There's the achiever who shows abilities early on and is nurtured to leave home. The biggest problem might be that those with academic abilities are groomed from an early age to get out, while others are neglected. This results in both a brain drain and poor outcomes for those who stay and return. If the priority is always on those who are going to leave, those who expected to stay or return receive fewer resources and less training. Others, who want to leave but don't have the academic chops to do so, often resort to other methods, the most common of which is, as previously mentioned, joining the military. Luke and Biggs could be said to fall into this category. They're not going to Space Harvard or whatever, they're joining up with the Imperial Academy. Again, George Lucas is kind of the same person. He tried to join the Air Force to get off his childhood walnut farm. He's such a self-insert.
Luke S. from Tatooine is not subtle. No, I think it is really kind of poignant that the opportunity that these two kids have is to join up with the military. Biggs and Luke both are like, we fucking hate the Imperials. This is not news to us. But the way off the planet is the Empire. So they're going to sign up. It's not complicated for them. It's barely even a question.
Oh, this is another Phineas and Ferb thing I could bring up, because since we're doing that this episode.
Go for it.
There's this great recruitment number called In the Empire, where Candace tells about how great the Empire is.
Candace is a stormtrooper, right? Do I remember that correctly?
Yeah, she's left because Tatooine is boring, and...
So that's Candace.
So you told me to come up with Star Wars examples.
Yeah, and you came back to me with Phineas and Ferb.
Yeah, no, like, but it's a real thing. Like, I know a lot of kids from I went to public school and elementary school and I guess what would be considered part of middle school. And a lot of kids I was in like scouts with or whatever who were like farm kids or whose dad like built houses or whatever. They joined the Navy. They joined the Air Force because they didn't want to live in Kuna, Idaho anymore and they couldn't afford to go to college.
When it must be said that this is partially like by design. The US military knows what they're doing. They know that the military affords people from less wealthy backgrounds opportunities that they would never have without selling your body to the state, right?
If you qualify, the Army College Fund can help you accumulate over $25,000 for tuition.
And your perspective on whether that's a good thing or a bad thing is obviously going to depend on your like political orientation, but like
and potentially whether or not your culture is rural.
I don't know. I know a lot of like people from where I come from, like the military is like perceived as almost noble for offering opportunities to people to get out of rural life. Whereas you would be like, that is exploitation.
Yeah, because it is. Because it's deeply exploitative, and it would be exploitative even if it weren't a really deliberate tactic that the military uses. Like, this is a documented phenomena.
It's even rougher for those who stay behind. The real incomes of high school graduates have dropped in recent years, which means that there is a massive tendency for those who live in rural areas, especially those who don't own an acreage or a farm, to be in very bad financial straits. Which is where we find Rey in the beginning of The Force Awakens.
Hell yeah.
I mean, I don't know if Rey could have left, but she is like kind of actively...
No, she could have. She absolutely could have.
There you go.
It is textual. Even when she does leave, she's like, I have to go back there. This is where I'm supposed to be.
She's chosen to stay behind on Jakku and scratch out an existence as a scavenger. She's not a farmer, but it's kind of close enough, isn't it?
When you live on Sand Junkyard Planet, being a scavenger is basically like farming.
I mean, in a lot of ways, scavenging, mining, and farming are kind of the same profession. It's like extracting sustenance from dirt.
Honestly, it's weird that we don't see that many actual farmers in Star Wars on screen.
We don't. I mean, the most prominent one might be in The Mandalorian in that one episode where he protects the village.
You mean episode 4?
Yeah.
Where they make booze out of like frogs? That's what spotchka is, right?
That's farming. Like, I know people who grow hops in Idaho, and that's what you make beer out of, so...
I guess, yeah, it is kind of like hops.
Frog ranching?
It's krill. You make them out of krill. It's just weird that we don't really see people growing foodstuffs.
It's always very, like, subtextual that someone is a farmer, right?
Yeah. Like, we have Moisture Farmer, and what it is essentially, we can say they're a farmer by putting a prop on the farm and not having to actually do anything more.
Well, I think I read in one of the texts that Cammy is, like, from an actual farmer family, Cammy, who we were talking about earlier, and that her family bought water from Luke and his family.
That sounds extremely true.
Owen, Beru, and Luke do not actually farm. They just get water and then sell it to other people, and people farm with that.
Mm-hmm. Anyway, sorry, just a weird aside, but we know that there are farms in Star Wars. It is weird that we never see them.
Almost as though, well, we'll get to that.
We'll get to that.
Rey stays behind for family reasons, which is a terribly common reason that people choose to stay in the country. Regardless of her reasons, though, she's doggedly determined to stay on Jakku. So she drives a battered speeder and has very little equipment. I was sort of struck because I rewatched the beginning of A New Hope and The Force Awakens for this, and I was sort of struck by how like jealous she is of the lady who has like the nicer brush than her sitting across from her.
Is that your read of that scene?
That's what I thought.
That she wants the brush? Because she's like picking at it with her like little tool, right?
Yeah, her crappy little tool. So I was thinking like, oh, she probably wants the nicer brush.
I've always read this as like this deeply poetic thing where she sees an old woman doing the same thing and is like, that is what I will become someday. Anyway, sure, she's jealous of the brush. I don't see why not.
Multiple interpretations of this scene are possible. And like many farmers, Rey is just barely getting by, right? Like she is not doing as good as the Skywalkers. Like,
She's kind of doing worse and worse and worse economically.
she's getting like less and less portions, whatever the hell that is.
It's her food. It's the bread.
No, I know, but like what determines a portion?
A portion is of like those food packs. It's probably like a meal.
Right, but she gets 1/4 portion and it's still like a full meal. So what is I was just a little confused by this.
Maybe it's enough to feed a family.
Oh, maybe. So 1/4 portion for her wouldn't be that bad then, because she's like...
But she needs enough to live more than like one meal. Anyway, I bet there's probably like some kind of actual explanation of the portion economic system in like the Alan Dean Foster Force Awakens novelization or some shit.
It's not that important.
I'm just saying, it's probably out there.
So... I don't think those of us who didn't grow up around family farmers truly understand how difficult farming is, even in the much more hospitable environment of the 21st century. Urbanites, particularly those of a liberal or leftist disposition, tend to view farmers as a sort of like evil petty bourgeoisie, but the reality is often quite different. I'll put it this way. There's a reason that US taxpayers pay for more than $30 billion in farm subsidies each year. Margins on most crops are razor thin, and equipment, seeds, fertilizer, labor, and water are cripplingly expensive. Even worse, modern equipment and even seeds are often proprietary, allowing agricultural conglomerates to charge massive premiums for repairs and planting.
The way some of these companies operate with regard to repairs and modifications of their shit is insidious. It's ghoulish.
Despicable. And the only reason that it's not like the number one like cause at the moment is because no one farms anymore. If it was like 1930, like this would be the number one cause in the country is to get right to repair on farm equipment.
Mm-hmm.
But because such a small proportion of the population is now farming, it's not as high a profile anymore.
Bonkers.
On the seeds are proprietary.
What?
Do you not know about this?
Kind of don't think so.
Oh, this is brutal. So like Monsanto and all these other kind of like seed companies that make genetically modified seeds will sell you their like, you know, super bug resistant, whatever resistant GMO seeds, but they won't produce seeds that you can use to replant the plants. When you harvest it, you can't replant those seeds because they're no good.
Oh my God.
So you have to go back and buy new seeds from the company every year.
They've specifically...
If you want the good crops.
Oh my God. Oh my God. Planned obsolescence, but it's for a fucking cucumber.
It's bad.
Oh my God. What the hell?
So it's really freaking hard if you're like, you know, an independent farmer. If you own like your, 500 acres and you grow like wheat or whatever, it's really hard. And it's even worse for people who don't work on farms. Like if you work in the service industry in a rural town or whatever, like small towns are basically the only place in the country where federal minimum wage is the actual minimum wage.
Why?
Because everywhere else the job market is like too hot for that. If you go to like Boise, Idaho or Draper, Utah or wherever, just like, sort of random spots in cities, you're gonna get paid like $13 an hour minimum for any job you apply for, regardless of what the minimum wage is.
Which sucks, but it is what it is.
Yeah, it's very market-based, the wage. But in these kind of rural communities, people are actually getting paid like the $7.25 that everyone likes to freak out about because the people who are paying them can't afford to pay them more because they're also dirt poor. So it's like, it's a bad situation. All this is to say that in a different world, I might be surprised that rural audiences found so little in common with Rey, since she's probably, fairly representative of a lot of people's experience compared to like kind of the bourgeois Luke. But what can I say? Culture wars are gonna culture war.
Yeah, I mean, misogyny is a hell of a drug.
Pretty much. I mean, it's not even misogyny. It is misogyny, but it's also like beyond misogyny in that talk radio told everyone that Disney's Star Wars was going to be woke, and then everyone decided that Disney Star Wars was woke. So
it was a decade ago. We were not yet misappropriating the word woke in such ways.
Right, but like they did the equivalent of that.
Yes, Ben Shapiro did describe The Force Awakens as SJW.
Cultural Marxism.
Cultural Marxism is alive and well. I mean, they do believe that. As a term, is alive and well, regrettably, because that is a much more specific thing. Anyway, not important. Not important whatsoever.
So, aside from sort of misogyny and racism also, because Finn, why didn't people from the rural part of the country care for The Force Awakens, and why is Star Wars so rural? I would posit that it's actually the same reason.
I want to clarify something here. Sophie, you are assuming that a non-zero amount of the contingent of Star Wars fans who specifically do not like The Force Awakens are from a rural background, right? We don't have anything to suggest that that is actually the case. I don't think like it's necessarily a majority, but like...
No, I mean, there's obviously merely given sort of political demographics and charting what people of a certain political inclination feel about the Star Wars movies versus what people of a different political inclination feel about the Star Wars movies. I think it's probably fair to say that a decent number of people in rural America did not like the new Star Wars.
Okay. Thank you. That's something I just wanted to understand about what you were suggesting.
Like, I'm not saying that there's like everyone in rural America hates The Force Awakens because of woke. No.
But it's like you might, I don't know, it's very possible that a good deal of the people who liked The Force Awakens the most, I mean, it wasn't urban leftists, it was your mom in the suburbs.
Pretty much. A rather new and interesting field of study in political science looks at what I like to call geographic polarization.
A huge new Pew Research Center study of 10,000 American adults finds us more divided than ever, with personal and political polarization at a 20-year high.
Political polarization will be familiar to all of you. You are alive during one of the most intense periods of polarization in recent memory.
USA.
It's not just us, Ellie. Like, it's everywhere.
USA.
Like Canada, Mexico, Europe, pretty much everywhere that is kind of except Japan because reasons, pretty much everywhere is very polarized at the moment.
USA.
But what happens when it occurs over geographic boundaries instead of just political ideologies? The urban-rural divide. Ellie, as a resident of the second most geographically polarized state in the country, will be rather familiar with this. Folks in Eastern Oregon are so estranged from their more liberal Western brethren that they're trying to join Idaho.
And let me tell you, you gotta be pretty desperate to want to join Idaho.
That's what I was going to say. As someone from Idaho, I'd like to warn them that this is a big mistake. The urban-rural divide is increasingly coming to dominate politics across the developed world, from tractors clogging the streets of Amsterdam to truckers doing the same in Ottawa and Washington, D.C.
Okay, I'm familiar with the trucker blockades. What are you referring to in Amsterdam?
So, the European Union is kind of famously a very regulatory entity.
Right.
Especially regarding climate change. And the thing about using farm equipment is that farm equipment produces a lot of carbon when you use it. And so a lot of carbon taxes that various EU countries have implemented are perceived by European farmers as being very unfair to them and sort of destroying their competitiveness on the international scale. So a lot of Dutch farmers and French farmers and other farmers in different parts of Europe are like driving tractors into like city centers and dumping manure everywhere and like blocking roads off with tractors and just sort of any sort of protest you can imagine that involves tractors.
When all you have is a hammer, etc., etc.
I do think it's interesting that they are going into the city specifically. We'll get to why I think that's interesting in a couple minutes. So why does this urban-rural divide exist? Surely, and I put on my Marxist economist glasses here, surely economic interests would unite the working poor and the rich across geographic boundaries.
Would that it were.
As we've mentioned, people living in rural areas often experience economic and social distress disproportionate to that experienced by those living in urban centers. And as Francis Fukuyama notes in his recent book, Identity, the Demand for Dignity and the Politics of Resentment, quote,
"Economic distress is often perceived by individuals not as resource deprivation, but as a loss of identity. Hard work should confer dignity on an individual, but that dignity is not recognized. Indeed, it is condemned, and other people who are not willing to play by the rules are given undue advantages." This link between income and status helps to explain why nationalist or religious conservative groups have been more appealing to many people than traditional left-wing ones based on economic class. The nationalist can translate loss of relative economic position into loss of identity and status. You have always been a core member of our great nation, but foreigners, immigrants, and your own elite compatriots have been conspiring to hold you down.
Rural people living in an increasingly cosmopolitan society increasingly feel themselves to be on the outside of their own society. The United States was built on Jacksonianism. It's supposed to be a republic of noble and virtuous farmers. But we've evolved into something different, and the people who identify most with that ideal feel like strangers in their own land. That's quoting from Fukuyama again. The country that they have so strongly identified themselves with is gone, and they have lost their identity as a result.
I wonder where these feelings of alienation could get a person.
Such a perceived loss lends itself well to new nationalist movements. That's why Trump and people like him are so popular in rural America. They present a different vision of their country than the cosmopolitan one embraced by the liberal, capital L, mainstream. A revived Jacksonian republic of hard-working wasps. Real America, the hard workers in the countryside, versus fake America, those inhabiting the cities, driving Priuses, and living off of welfare. Rural, then, becomes more than just a geographic descriptor. It becomes an identity.
Oh shit. We made it. We made it, gang.
We made it to the point of the episode. Oh my gosh, only what? 45 minutes in. We're doing pretty well. Political scientists call this phenomenon rural consciousness, a political and personal orientation that, quote, signifies an identification with rural people and rural places and denotes a multifaceted resentment against cities. That's from Catherine Kramer's seminal work on the topic, The Politics of Resentment, Rural Consciousness in Wisconsin and the Rise of Scott Walker, which I'll quote again here. Rural consciousness has, quote,
3 elements. 1. A belief that rural areas are ignored by decision makers, including policymakers. 2. A perception that rural areas do not get their fair share of resources. And 3. A sense that rural folks have fundamentally distinct values and lifestyles, which are misunderstood and disrespected by city folks.
The belief is essentially that rural areas, often called the flyover states by those who live in them, are getting nothing, despite being worthy of attention and power, while those in metropolitan centers are hoarding resources and power, despite being unworthy and lazy. To quote Kramer again,
in a politics of resentment, resentment toward fellow citizens is front and center. People understand their circumstances as the fault of guilty and less deserving social groups, not as the product of broad social, economic, and political forces.
I mean, this mindset is one that, my mom has when I talk to her. Not so much hatred for people from cities, but this sort of very incorrect, let's be clear, idea that cities receive a disproportionate amount of resources compared to rural areas, and political power as well. When you hear people talk about this, they'll be like, no one in Congress cares about what we think in the country. No one cares about, we have no representation compared to the cities. They have all the power. And I think that's a really interesting sort of thing to think about, because as a political scientist, I'm aware that rural people have a vastly disproportionate amount of political power in this country because of this, either lovely or terrible thing that we have called the United States Senate. I believe, and don't quote me on this because this may or may not be true, but I saw something recently that said California has 38 million people, right? And 2 senators. The same number of people in a whole bunch of other states have something closer to 40 senators because they're from states with smaller populations. Regardless of the fact that rural states have a disproportionate amount of political power and receive, much more resources in the form of farm subsidies, military investment, not to mention the fact that they generally pay less taxes, pay less into the federal government per amount that they receive than cosmopolitan states, there's still a perception that they are sort of unheard, unlistened to, unwanted, and under-resourced.
Why?
It's a narrative. It's an identity.
I guess it is easier to build identity around oppression narratives, right? In contrast to the thing that you see as hurting you. I mean, that's often how populism takes off, right?
And I mean, it could also be that this sort of oppression feeling, let's call it an oppression feeling. This sort of oppression feeling is more relative than real. As we've discussed earlier, there was this time in American history when rural people had literally all the power. The Jacksonian Republic, right? Only landholding men can vote. And as that slips away and turns into sort of what will, in the near future, be the opposite situation where this is
where landholding men can't vote.
Well, no, this is a cosmopolitan country where everyone can vote.
Oh, no.
And hopefully everyone's voice is equally heard. There's a sort of feeling that we're losing our power, because they are. relatively speaking.
Right. When you have a disproportionate amount of power, to have a proportionate amount of power is a loss.
A big loss. Even though they still don't have a proportionate amount of power, they still have a disproportionate amount of power.
Even an amount of power approaching slightly less disproportionate.
We're just dealing in different degrees of disproportionality here.
This sort of idea makes me think of the ways in which kind of necessarily for people of color to get opportunities that they deserve and frankly are owed for wrongs that have been historically done to them. Slavery, but also all the other things. Like, lots of people have been fucked over in a lot of different ways. USA. Necessarily, white people are going to get less if you think about it in that sort of way, which I don't think you should. I think that is really misleading, but like that is kind of a threat to, I mean, I don't mean it in the buzzwordy sense, to white supremacy. If you have a white supremacist culture, to even attempt to move away from that is a threat to that supremacy. And so that is an actual thing. And that's, I guess, emotionally complicated to acknowledge.
That there is like a feeling of loss, even if we all know that the loss is an actual thing.
Well, but in a sense, the loss is an actual thing. It's just an actual thing that shouldn't matter, I get, or not.
Or shouldn't have existed in the first place.
Right. It's like that loss is real. To feel that loss is not
unnatural.
Yeah. And that's emotionally complicated because we have to acknowledge that just because we want a just society doesn't mean that power is infinite. Does that make sense?
I get it completely.
That's not a comfortable reality. You have to distribute stuff. It's about redistribution. It's not just expansion.
The narrative becomes that we are virtuous, hardworking, and honest. So the cities are sinful, lazy, and filled with liars and cheats. Because the cities are rich, we are poor. People come to believe the opposite as well. I've talked to many people from the city who view people living in rural areas as almost subhuman. People are just sort of unable to comprehend how someone might come to view the world through a rural lens. And they're like, is that even human, almost? A great example of the sort of narrative that these identities can produce is that of Lothal from Star Wars Rebels.
In the absence of Governor Price, you have had a single, simple objective, Minister, to protect the Empire's industrial interest here. Interests which are vital to our expansion throughout the Outer Rim.
So Lothal is properly conceived of a rural setting, but a lot of what we see of it is kind of its capital city.
Because it's Space Indiana.
Right, because it's Space Indiana. That city is occupied by the Empire. The Empire conscripts children. It celebrates imperial rule with parades in the streets. It co-opts the labor of farmers and forces them into industry. The industrialization of Lothal is kind of this ever-present threat in Star Wars Rebels. The show ends, the day is won when Grand Admiral Thrawn's TIE Defender plant is destroyed. The victory is not the Empire is gone. I mean, it is, but it's like, it's specifically the Empire cannot continue manufacturing on this world. The Empire cannot continue to co-opt labor.
Urbanize.
Right. Going back to the idea that we don't really see a lot of farmers in Star Wars, we do see farmers on Lothal. We see farming communities that are struggling disproportionately under Imperial rule, I would say.
In other words, the urban, by its very existence, is an assault on the rural. We see this countless places in Star Wars, this sort of motif. How many tiny villages are invaded by droids in the Clone Wars, like Innocents of Ryloth, right?
The thing about settlements in Star Wars is that whether or not they are rural or urban is generally down to like the way the street looks and their proximity to trees or rocks or stuff. Because in Star Wars, a city can be anything from a pretty big village to literally the whole world. I don't know. We see communities that are urban. I mean, the separatist occupation of Iziz, which is the Onderonian capital, Iziz is a city, but even the Empire's presence there feels like this threat of the industrial, of the urban, of all of this shit. Because it's like their normal government is... I don't know, hick shit. It's this fucking king. It's dudes in the jungle. There's also, kind of a noble savage angle, but I'm not. We talked about that last time.
There's this fear that the very essence of modern industrial civilization is literally destroying the agrarian past. The imagery practically screams, the rural is under assault. I mean, think about it. The disruptions in the peaceful, though imperfect, agrarian lives of Luke and Ray are always from the outside. Violence and disruption is from the city, while peace and order are inherent to the countryside.
Well, and if we think about this in like metaphorical galactic terms, it's not the city, it's the core. The core is urban and the outer rim is rural.
Right. The outer rim is like left to its own devices, like imperfect. You know, we have huts and we have crime brigades and whatever, but mostly we're chill. We're just going to live in our village and farm. Oh no, core politics are destroying our, nice farming planet. Oh no.
I mean, this is a massive part of the impetus for the Clone Wars, right? People who are on the periphery feeling disadvantaged by the Republic, not feeling represented, not feeling like they are benefiting, like they are only losing in this equation.
So the question becomes, why would Star Wars, now in its post-Lucas years, continue to be such a ruralist franchise when it's almost exclusively produced by writers from the cities and suburbs? Well, that's the really interesting bit about rural consciousness. One need not be from a rural area to hold it. You can see this most clearly in what I'll call the social posturing of suburb and exurbanites. Even for people who have never worked on a farm a day in their life and never need to haul anything or go off-road, trucks are becoming the vehicle of choice. Country music stations are a dime a dozen in sprawlscapes across America, with suburbanites raptly singing along to "Try That in a Small Town" and "Let Your Boys Be Country" on their daily freeway commutes. Even more tellingly, those in the suburbs will complain about the evils of the liberal cities even more vociferously than those living in actual small towns.
Yeah, the number of people I've known who were from Dallas, Texas, but still viewed themselves as like small town. What the hell is that about?
Dallas is the fourth largest city in America. There are almost 10 million people living in the Dallas area. That's bigger than San Francisco.
Fucking Texas, man.
But everyone there thinks that Dallas is a small town and that they're super country. It's the same thing with, not to shit on my family because most of them are fairly nice people, but it's the same thing with basically my entire family. They all live in the suburbs like I do. They all grew up in the suburbs like I do, but they all wear cowboy boots and hats and drive trucks around and listen to country music. And they think that they're from a small town. Oh, I should have said I did. I mean, I guess until a year ago, I technically still lived in the suburbs. I lived in South Salt Lake for a year.
Yeah,
so
just a small town girl.
And, lest you think you're off the hook, even urban Americans hold to something like a watered-down version of a rural identity.
God damn it.
You can't tell me you have never laughed about a European being awed by a 5-hour drive on Twitter. You can't tell me that because you have.
Yeah, I have.
Thought it's funny.
I have.
Everyone thinks that's funny. Because the US is, after all, we're big and rural, unlike those sissy, compact European countries whose residents can't imagine what our lives are like here in the red-blooded US of A. Ever heard jokes about how the French are lazy and never work? I bet you felt a bit smug about how, much of a hard-working Protestant American you are. You did, and I know you did because everyone has felt this way. And all of this sounds a bit familiar, because we talked about it earlier. Because it's just the same sort of rural identity crap of being we're so much more of a country than they are, but transposed into my apartment in downtown Salt Lake City. Even you, oh urbanite, are not immune to the power of Hallmark Christmas movies.
It's America. The rot is at the core of America.
It's the Jacksonian thing again. Our society is inherently ruralist. We are predisposed towards viewing the country as inherently peaceful and virtuous, and the city as inherently chaotic and lascivious. While the degree to which we hold to this identity is highly dependent on our locale, I'm increasingly convinced that which side of urban-rural polarization we fall on is increasingly dependent on whether we turn our perceived rurality against our fellow citizens or against foreigners. Therefore, because we are all secretly rural at heart, Star Wars is overwhelmingly rural and filled with virtuous farmers who leave only reluctantly to fight for the Jacksonian order because that's how every American perceives themselves.
Because the American rot is at the heart of Star Wars.
Because the character of the American people has been imposed upon Star Wars for no good reason. Let some Europeans make Star Wars and see what happens.
It must be said, Star Wars is also often made by British people.
Oh, great.
I want to ask Chris about this.
British people have their own rot around thinking that they're, like, special.
Yeah, I mean, have you read The Lord of the Rings?
Yeah, right. Have you heard Jerusalem? Like, and did those feet in ancient time? Like,
God.
Motherfuckers think they're so cool that Jesus went to Britain specifically, of all places, while he was alive. Like, what are you on? Like, Anglophones, we all think we're special.
The takeaway is that no one is special. Fuck you.
No, the takeaway is that because America has such a well-developed rural identity and so many of us adopt it, even though we aren't necessarily actually rural, Star Wars is kind of an inherently ruralist franchise and prefers rural landscapes and stories about people who are sort of rural to what you might call an urbanist conception of art. Now, I should draw a distinction here between rural consciousness we discuss kind of in the middle of this and the ruralism I talk at the end. Rural consciousness, as we've discussed it, is mostly like a political phenomenon specifically confined to conservatives in the United States of America. Ruralism is kind of a broader affinity for the pastoral, you might call it.
Rural consciousness is the idea specifically identifying whatever the fuck is going on in Middle America right now. And ruralism is the rot.
At the heart of Anglo-Saxon civilization. So Ellie, what do you think? I put this as a discussion question. Am I right or am I full of pretentious academic crap?
I think you're right to identify that within Star Wars. There is definitely a contingent of Star Wars fan, and I would say I'm one of them, who is like so horny for any depiction of the urban. We're like, oh my god, we're gonna get city shit. We're gonna get Coruscant. We're gonna get the politics of this location and all of these people. And then what Star Wars shows actually do is like a guy shooting another guy in the desert. Because that is what Star Wars kind of fundamentally is. And I'm not saying that the people who want urban Star Wars are wrong for that. I am just saying there's a reason why that is as rare as it is. And I think it is because Star Wars... Did you do all that work just to say that Star Wars is American?
I think I kind of did.
Shit.
Well, that's why we write papers, folks. To prove that things are bad.
I don't think that we're going to be able to productively answer this question, but I do want an open-ended question, which is you present this idea that which side of urban to rural polarization you fall on is primarily where your like ruralist resentment falls. And
I mean, you could maybe call it even just like nativist resentment, right?
Yeah, kinda.
I think that would almost be a better word for it. Is like, where does your nativist resentment go? Does it go to foreigners? Or does it go to the city?
But I feel like the further left you go, and I'm not doing horseshoe theory bullshit. I feel like it's weirder for leftists. I feel like it's harder to diagnose. Where do we fucking put the ANCOMs, you know?
The ANCOMs have developed a separate political and social identity outside of that of the nation state.
We are evolved.
Maybe regressed, perhaps, because the original human consciousness does not rely on a nation state to sustain its existence.
Correct.
But as we develop the nation state, individual humans have increasingly identified themselves with it. And so, I don't know, ANCOMs are almost returning to the state of nature.
I mean, a proper anarchist would argue that the state of nature is statist propaganda, but you know.
Oh, yeah, I figure. But you know what I mean, right?
I do know what you mean. I think you make a compelling point there, which is that this is specifically in regard to statist political polarization, because if you are actually committed to anarchism, you are kind of not going to have that sort of... It's not going to be built around that.
Well, right. And no offense to our anarchist listeners and co-hosts, but I'm not sure that this matters that much because there are so few anarchists in America.
Oh, yeah. I'm not saying it's like I'm not saying this is like a pressing political question. I just think it's interesting.
Okay.
To ask.
It is interesting to ask.
Yeah, certainly. The vast majority of even mildly politically aware people in America, I am comfortable categorizing within this dichotomy. I think you have kind of hit on something. I've talked to card-carrying Democrats. I know how people think. At least I like to think I do.
The Fukuyama book that I referenced is it's a really good book. I mean,
You do be loving Fukuyama.
Fukuyama gets a lot of crap for his end of history book being wrong, even though it kind of wasn't. But he's a really smart kind of author, and his book is all about kind of the development of various nationalisms, how we sort of conceptualize ourselves within the nation state, and how that developed in kind of I want to say 1800s, really, right? Because the nation state, as we perceive it now, did not exist before that time.
Right.
And so this whole sort of identifying so strongly with a nation and with, heavy air quotes here, a people is a very new phenomenon. So I don't know. It's very interesting the ways in which these things ebb and flow and which we develop sort of subnational identities that are still sort of grounded in this nationalism. Urban American is as much a political identity as rural American. It's just gauche to talk about it in a way that talking about rural identity is not, if that makes sense.
Yeah, why do you think that is?
Because liberalism. I mean, to be urban American is to be kind of a liberal in all senses of that word. Politically, socially.
Aesthetically.
Aesthetically, yeah. What's sort of the stereotypical urban American? It's kind of an effete 30-something white man who drives a Prius, drinks soy latte, and likes Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren.
Or a person who isn't white.
Or a person who isn't white. There are two sort of diametrically opposed.
Even worse.
Even worse. But it's as much an identity as is the rural one. The difference is that it has some kind of variations. As you mentioned, there are also minorities who are kind of urban Americans. But if you say that, it's racist because it is.
Yeah, because I think it's worth mentioning that sometimes urban is used as a slur.
That's right.
USA.
If you call someone an urban American as a white person and you're a conservative, you might as well be calling them a race traitor because that's basically what you're calling them.
Or you just use it to refer to someone who isn't white.
Yeah, I didn't really go into it a lot because I always am sort of, I don't want to say uncomfortable, but it's not my place or my thing to try and be super critical about race issues, both as, a white chick and also as a white chick from Idaho, which makes it way worse because I knew 2 black people my entire life.
Oh, Sophie.
So I try and keep my analysis grounded in things that I actually know something about, but there is very much a racial element to this rural identity thing, right? Like I said that part of it is being a WASP, a white Anglo-Saxon Protestant, right? And that's true.
And if we come back to the Star Wars uses non-humans as a deeply regrettable analog for non-white people.
There are a lot of aliens in Mos Eisley. There are not so many outside of Mos Eisley.
Yeah, how many non-humans are you seeing in Tashi Station? Or on Luke's farm? Or
Anchorhead.
But port cities, but Coruscant. But this is where you see the broadest diversity of alien life. And sometimes in Star Wars that is a celebration, right? But it is also, here is where the crime is. We've talked about this. Star Wars uses non-human people as analogs for non-white people. Yikes. And then it goes and makes them all do crime.
Puts them all in cities and then makes the cities full of crime.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's problematic. It's problematic.
Yeah, what the fuck, Star Wars? Anyway, very much the urban-rural divide there is a part of that.
Yeah, no problematic racial undertones there.
Add it to the pile. Add it to the fucking aliens thing. Jesus Christ.
Look, if you want to understand the whole kind of, I don't want to call it Trumpist movement because that makes me sound like I'm CNN, but the Trumpist movement, if you want to understand it, I really do recommend Catherine Kramer's The Politics of Resentment, Rural Consciousness in Wisconsin and the Rise of Scott Walker. It's very insightful. It's become a seminal text for a reason, but yeah, it's a good book. You should read it. And that's all I got.
All right. Let's move over to some emails. Sophie, where can people email us at?
daughtersferrix@gmail.com.
Yes, indeed. Our first email is from Loudon Ferguson. They say, "Hi, daughters. I recently found your podcast and have absolutely blown through it, and I've loved your commentary throughout. I happened to already be reading Chris Kempshall's excellent book when I found your podcast, and between that and your wonderful episode interviewing him, one element I found especially interesting was how he referenced George Lucas engaging with popular understandings of history rather than a deeper background. This is very relevant to me as someone who studies similar topics, and got me thinking about how archaeologists are portrayed in Star Wars, especially with regard to my beloved Dr. Shelley Afra. Her portrayal clearly takes a lot of inspiration from Indiana Jones and other pulp archaeologists, as befits the kind of stories Star Wars seeks to tell. However, the series tends to portray archaeologists as at best naive and idealistic, and at worst, thieves, con artists, and willing imperial contributors. I was wondering what thoughts you might have on this, especially given the historical context of early archaeologists working within colonialist and imperialist aims, and the ongoing decolonial efforts within the field. I have a lot of thoughts on this and try to keep them under control, so hopefully this email isn't too long. Keep up the good work. Loudon Ferguson.
Good email. That is not something I ever expected to hear, but what I will say is the British Museum has a lot of stuff that does not belong to it. And
really hot take there, Sophie.
I know, shocking. No, I mean, it's very interesting the ways in which kind of the field of archaeology is like so very rooted with the kind of European empires of the 19th and 20th centuries. I was reading just the other day about, or listening, I should say, it was on a podcast, about how the Elgin marbles, the kind of big friezes from Greece, were taken back to the United Kingdom from Greece because the Ottoman Empire had sort of colonialized Greece, and then the British somehow paid them or something to take them. I don't know. But I just found that whole thing very interesting. So I don't have a lot to say on the topic, but I think that one, museums worldwide should be able to have collections from worldwide, and two, those collections should be, with permission from people living in the place that they were taken from, and, presumably just compensation provided as well. That's all I got.
Loudon, you are correct to point out that archaeologists in Star Wars tend to just be Indiana Jones. When a guy is an archaeologist, it means Indiana Jones. Like, it is the job that Indy does, for Star Wars.
The character of Indiana Jones is such that he is an archaeologist.
The character of an archaeologist is such that he is Indiana Jones.
Ooh.
But you've also kind of hit on this idea that archaeologists in the setting are kind of naive. And in my mind, immediately goes toward Madeline's son, the archivist also from Dr. Aphra, who makes a lot of bad choices and suffers for it. I think broadly, and I mean broadly, I'm not painting with finesse here. I don't have a ton of examples off the top of my head. Star Wars tends to depict educated people in very particular ways. One, they tend to be rich. And with that, they tend to less often be aligned with the forces of good, whatever insurgency, with the rebellion, with the resistance. And they tend to be aligned with the state. This is obviously a very limited view of what scholars are and how they operate, but at the same time, it makes sense. If you have money, you are more likely to have an education. If you benefit enough from the current regime, then you're going to be in bed with that regime, or at least you're more likely to be. It makes me really wonder what exactly Beaumont Kin's deal is. Is he just not part of a very prestigious school? And there are educated people who do align themselves with the good guys and whatever, but I don't know. I think Star Wars has this kind of less than charitable view on university-educated people a lot of the time. At best, it tends to be neutral. Maybe that's a ruralist thing. I don't know.
That is kind of a ruralist thing, actually.
It's extremely a ruralist thing.
People in kind of the country, not universally, obviously, but there is a tendency to view people who are educated other than doctors as sort of inherently suspicious.
Even sometimes doctors.
Often doctors, yeah. That's true. I hadn't really thought about that, but it is a big tendency in rural areas to distrust people with university educations, because a university education is something that can only be obtained in the city and is therefore something of the city always, and therefore foreign.
Anyway, I wonder if there's some kind of real connection there. I would have to really dive into some certain characters to have some deeper thoughts about that, but that is kind of my impression of people like archaeologists in the setting. Thank you for your email, Loudon.
Yeah, it was a good one. Thank you.
Our next email is from Rowan. They say, "Good afternoon, daughters. I'm sure you touched on it in an earlier episode, but I want to bring attention to how akin the funeral march during the Andor finale was to just about any protest or gathering in 2020 based on my experience. Local groups getting a permit for a community gathering, often a vigil, it being granted with strict limitations, the gathering inevitably breaking at least one of the stipulations, and the deployment of armed and armored riot cops. Of course, nothing has ever escalated to cops opening fire with lethal rounds, but it was a scene that became familiar day in and day out for 2 months of being on the ground during the uprising. Honestly, the series as a whole could be used as a comparison to any major city during 2020. The multiple different groups and sects, with each having their own beliefs and goals, trying to be brought together to do something as simple as knocking down a statue. But I'm just starting to ramble. Love the show. Thanks, Rowan.
Big topic.
I think people in the United States became very familiar with the way in which, I guess, protest repression by cops looks, and Andor definitely depicts that, right? The idea that you give people certain limitations, you give them the permit so that you're not just cracking down, but you have the permitting process in place just to dissuade them from doing anything. These are all really classic, the regime does not want you to do shit techniques. And while I think certainly the actual political contexts for what's happening on Ferrix versus what happened in the summer of 2020 in America and, across the world, the actual political contexts of that are fairly different. I would very much argue that what happens on Ferrix is pretty politically uncomplicated. I think you are right to see aesthetic parallels there, and certainly emotional ones, right? Because it's meant to make you feel a certain way about the way the Empire is treating the people of Ferrix. The fucking Imperials, it's not stormtroopers, it's cops with riot gear. This is not an accident. It wants you to feel a certain way, it wants you to think a certain way, and it is referencing visuals that I think we are all plenty familiar with.
I was going to say, I feel like the sort of emotionality of it is almost more important than the visual similarity, because a lot of people, myself not included, because I was in Idaho during Black Lives Matter and frankly not a lot was going on. But a lot of people can probably sort of recognize how sort of terrifying it is to be disrupted as a protest by the police and how shattering it can be almost,
Well, yeah, I mean, a shot that really sticks out to me from Andor Season 1, Episode 12 is Linus Mosk, this former sergeant who was on the ground with Cyril, and after the riot is just looking fucking dead inside. I think he's drinking on the street, and it's just, he is nominally aligned with the cops, and even that was
horrifying.
If there's one word for how it felt, seeing that kind of shit every day, it is horrifying. And I think that is a big part of it.
Yeah.
It's not wrong for Star Wars to adopt certain visual and emotional signifiers in different political contexts. You don't have to mirror literally everything. I don't want anyone to mistake what I'm saying here, but I do think that's what it's doing, right? It wants you to feel a certain way about this conflict. It wants you to know that this outrage is just, the repression is not, and kind of the main aftermath is kind of just horror. As far as we can tell, the people of Ferrix didn't get anything from it. Thanks for your email, Rowan.
Yeah, thanks, Rowan.
Our last email is from Eli. Hey daughters, I was browsing YouTube and came across some awful chud videos about the Acolyte, and it reminded me that good Star Wars content exists. And to thank you for the incredible podcast that you make. Every episode is super fun to listen to, and the lens through which you analyze Star Wars is always interesting. You have my utmost praise, and I eagerly await every episode. Thanks, Eli. For my question, we have seen Jedi take on different jobs throughout Star Wars, generals, detectives, and I'm sure much more in media I haven't seen. But as seen in the Clone Wars, they aren't any better at them than other people, and sometimes much worse. So, if in, say, the Old Republic there was a separation of church and state, and most Jedi needed to get regular, for Star Wars, jobs, what might they actually be good at? As the Force flows through all living things, and I'm a baker, I imagine it would be useful to check if I actually put yeast into some dough. All the best, Eli.
Oh, I think that they would be great in a heavy industrial capacity, right? You need to shift a big plate of something or whatever, lifting crucibles filled with molten lava or whatever, or molten steel, and you can't come close to it because otherwise you'll burn up and die. What if you can have your Jedi, blue collar Jedi across the room dumping it into the ingots remotely? I don't know. Jedi would be pretty good at fabrication, I think. What do you think, Ellie?
I think that's really funny. I think Eli, your line about yeast is very funny. I will say, I would consider this a question wrongly put. I just say that because, one, I don't think the Jedi are notably the same or worse at the jobs they do than non-Jedi. I think the roles that they actually fulfill, for instance, Jedi do seem to be quite good generals. At the very, very least, you know, Jedi are like old feudal generals where they are on the ground doing the fighting. Jedi are fantastic at that. And what Jedi detectives we see seem to be pretty solid. If you have psychometry and you can literally pick up an object and see its like past, that's pretty helpful. But I also don't think that if the Jedi were not integrated into the Republic, that they would have day jobs. I think Jedi is a full-time gig. And I think as Jedi...
So the Jedi Order has like a big-ass endowment, is what you're saying?
Well, I think if the Jedi are not integrated into the Republic, they make do off of potentially alms. They probably maintain their own communities. They do agrarian work, just like anybody else. And they probably do not use the Force for that because of their respect for the Force. Yeah, I think fundamentally it's not very Jedi to use the Force in your day job if you have one. And, you know, other Force teachings might disagree with that, but we're talking about the Jedi. I think that if you're a Jedi, you still act as a diplomat. You still act as a peacekeeper. You still try to perform aid. Just because you're not doing that through the mechanics of a state that you're aligned with doesn't mean that you're not still doing that. And I think probably the Jedi Order started off that way. I think that before they aligned themselves with the Republic, the Jedi acted as independent mediators and aid workers, and that's what they spent their time doing. I don't imagine that people were moonlighting at the Jedi Temple, reading texts and studying the blade or whatever, and daylighting as accountants. I'm sure there are people who historically have done that, but like, one, the Jedi Order has to maintain itself. There are accountants in the Jedi Temple who are doing accounting for the Jedi. And two, I think when you are working outside of the Jedi Order, you're doing Jedi shit. I think that is fundamentally part of it. For a fun answer, though, I will say bus driver, because if you can feel everything around you through the Force, you are probably better able to avoid accidents. You also might be able to tell when someone is coming for your bus, but you can't see them, so you can wait just a little bit longer for them to get on your bus. Because you're a nice bus driver, because you're a Jedi. That's my answer.
I think Jedi would make a good bus driver, you're right. They would leave people behind less, probably.
Yeah, probably way less. Because the fundamental thing about a Jedi is that they attempt to be deeply good.
Ontologically good.
They strive for ontological good. Whether or not they achieve it is less a part of it. Thank you for your email, Eli. If you have any questions, suggestions, or corrections, you can send them to our show email, daughtersferrix@gmail.com.
If you want to listen to new episodes, they release every other Wednesday. You can find us on most places you can listen to podcasts. You can find sources for this episode on our website, daughtersofferrix.com, and follow us on Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok at FerrixPod, FerrixPod.
Thank you to our comrades Joel Miranda and Emrys Nereus for making this episode possible. If you want to support the show, visit patreon.com/daughtersofferrix. I have been Eleanor Mueller. You can find me at The Letter Bomber on most platforms. Sophie, what about you?
You can find me at Sophia and SLC on Twitter, at @theredline_pod, where we talk about trains, and at Episcopiled, where I talk about religion.
This episode was written by Sophia Dunstan and edited by me, Eleanor Mueller. Our podcast art is by Jill Mueller. Our intro and outro music was arranged by me, with themes by Nicholas Bertel and John Williams. Thanks for listening. Do you know Star Wars is American?
We are finding this out more and more every time we produce an episode.
Regrettably.
God bless the United States.
American brackets derogatory.
Happy 4th of July.
Oh yeah, this will be a little bit after that.
Well, that's okay. They can celebrate in their hearts.
Go fuck yourself, America. Bye-bye.
Bye.